I'm Michael Green, Senior Vice President at CSIS, and it's our high privilege and honor to host the Honorable Senator and Foreign Minister Bob Carr. At dinner last night, the Minister invited me, when we do our dialogue in a moment, to try to surpass question time in Parliament. I've seen question time, and I know I'm not capable of matching that Westminster level of repartee, but we will do our best. And then we'll turn it over to you for some questions. But we'd like to open the proceedings by inviting Sandy Berger, our distinguished former National Security Advisor and Chair of the Stonebridge Albright Group, to make some opening remarks and introduce our guest today. Thank you. Sandy.
Well, thank you, Mike, very much, and congratulations to you and to Ernie for the terrific work that you're doing here with Pacific Partners at CSIS. I also want to recognize Kim Beasley and Ambassador Quayshan, who've been a tremendous asset to our alliance in the region in their roles as ambassador of Australia and the Philippines, and also welcome Ambassador Thompson from Fiji. It's an honor for me to introduce Senator Bob Carr, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Commonwealth of Australia, the longest-serving Premier of New South Wales from 1995 to 2005. Senator Carr was instrumental to the success of the Sydney Olympic Games, cementing Sydney's status as a truly global city. In fact, I'm told, Senator Carr, you're one of the only Australian politicians to enjoy any measure of success while saying that you do not enjoy sports. Surely that's a phenomenon brought about by the fact that Australia does not have baseball. After completing his first public service career, Senator Carr settled into active retirement as one of Australia's most respected voices on public policy. But a year ago, Prime Minister Julia Gillard recalled him to public service, appointed him to the Senate so that he could serve his country once more as Minister of Foreign Affairs, and we're very glad she did. Senator Carr, like the government he represents, is everything we look for in an ally and a partner. He is smart and frank. We know that when he speaks about the alliance relationship and our shared values in the Asia-Pacific, we're getting straight talk from a well-placed friend. He has a deep and abiding appreciation of our history. He's so deeply immersed in the history of the Civil War and President Lincoln that you might have substituted for Daniel Day-Lewis in the Lincoln movie, I'm told. And like his fellow Australians, he's tough. You don't last 10 years as Premier of New South Wales without throwing a few charming Mao jars around. We try not to read anything in your choice of projectiles in terms of the pivot. Which brings me to the subject of today's remarks by Senator Carr, our shared interest in the Asia-Pacific region. The United States has no better friend and ally in the region than Australia. We see it in our shared commitment to the liberal international order in the region, in our military cooperation in Afghanistan and Darwin, and around the region, and in the extraordinary level of people-to-people ties and mutual admiration for each other's countries and cultures. We've already seen it in the cooperation between our two countries on issues from North Korea to Syria in the UN Security Council, where we're pleased to welcome Australia as a fellow member in January for the first time in more than a quarter century, an achievement which the Foreign Minister played a key role. And let there be no doubt, as President Obama has said in his landmark address to your Parliament in Canberra 2 years ago, the United States is a Pacific power, and we are here to stay. Together, our partnership in the Asian-Pacific century will continue to support prosperity, democracy, and the aspirations for people around the world. My pleasure to introduce Senator Bob Carr.
So we're going to, the minister's agreed to subject himself to questions from me and then from the audience. But let me first also welcome our viewers online who can also follow us on Twitter. The address is @PACPartners, PACPARTNERS DC, @PACPartnersDC at CSIS, and the hashtag is # CSIS Live. My colleague Ernie Bauer is on vacation on the beach. Ernie, I encourage you to put down your daiquiri and also tweet as we proceed. Minister, there's literally a global range of questions we could ask you, given Australia's foreign policy responsibilities and contribution. But I want to start with the Asia-Pacific region. One of the trends that has struck many of us in Washington is the manner in which former prime ministers in Australia and other prominent intellectuals are framing Australia's foreign policy as an inevitable choice between Washington and Beijing. And I'd like to open by asking you how you see that debate in Australia. Should we worry about it? And how you see how the U.S. fits in your China strategy and China in your U.S. strategy and so forth.
Well, there are many observations I can make about that. One is this. Whenever we engage with our Chinese friends or our American friends, we're told by them how strong is the relationship between China and America. And given that, I think we Australians are entitled to say that's a false choice. We don't have to choose between China and America. We can have deep engagement with both. After all, if both China and America are saying we're getting on well, we've got a robust working relationship, we're solving problems together, why should we be in a quandary here? You take the broad lineaments of our relationship with China. We reject any notion of containing China. We reject that. In the two territorial disputes, South China Sea, East China Sea, we are, like the United States, neutral. We take no sides in these competing territorial claims. We want a settlement in line with international law, including reference to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, but not limited to that. And we are working towards a deeper engagement with China. And on the other hand, we've got embedded deep in our DNA a desire to have a strong relationship with the US, including a security partnership. And why wouldn't we? It goes back over 100 years when Japan defeated Russia in 1904-05. Australians started thinking along the lines, we are a small population, a tiny population in those days, a vast continent, we speak English, we're a parliamentary democracy, we've got to think about a relationship with the US. You had an Australian Prime Minister at the time, Alfred Deakin, who speculated about extending the Monroe Doctrine to the Southwest Pacific. So this goes back a long way. It goes back over 100 years. And I've said to Chinese friends, just as we understand notions about China's foreign policy by reference to a long history, going back to notions of the Middle Kingdom, a China that during the Ming Dynasty rejected any idea of overseas conquest or colonization. We all know the story of how they chose not to colonize countries they ventured to with their great maritime excursions. I've said to Chinese, just as we understand your foreign policy today by reference to your history, you've got to understand Australia's position, our desire to have a relationship with the United States through our history. But I would say that some of those views expressed in Australia that we've got to choose are a little too simple-minded for my taste, and I think that of the Australian people who want a deep, growing engagement with both the US and China.
Thank you. So I think for the 6 administrations, basically since 1972, Republicans and Democrats in government have rejected containment and have pursued a consistent policy of engagement and trying to expand relations. But increasingly, the past 3-4 administrations have paid more and more attention to the balance of power in Asia, which is different from containment. But the word you hear in Washington is we need to think how we shape the environment and how we encourage China to become, for example, a responsible stakeholder. How do you see Australia's role in this endeavor, not just cooperating with China, but in trying to shape the environment so that we can feel more confident about China's role as its power increases?
Well, very much in encouraging China to be part of multilateral engagement. And we've been encouraged, of course, by what's happened in the last decade, China's involvement in WTO. We'd like to see deeper Chinese engagement with climate change. I think China needs to solve the extremely challenging environmental problems it faces domestically through cooperative networks with the rest of the world. But if we're going to make, Bill Clinton said years ago, he said that the future is going to be shaped by how China chooses to express its greatness. And we've got every reason to think that the new leadership in China especially will seek to express China's more and more undeniable re-emergence as the great power it was before the mid-19th century by engaging and by investigating, among other things, the uses of soft power. You see, I get asked from time to time, are you concerned about the Chinese providing aid in the South Pacific? Australia feels it's got a special responsibility in that arc of remarkably interesting nations, from Papua New Guinea right through to Polynesia. It's investigating that part of the world, you're struck by the fact that this is a continent of islands, the world's largest ocean. I think there's nothing we can do to dissuade China from offering aid to Vanuatu or Fiji or PNG. I would encourage them, and I would encourage them to share with us the lessons we've learnt about the most effective development assistance in those countries. So a deeper engagement by China, I don't think we've got anything to lose. I think the world has got a great deal to gain. The re-emergence of China is good for China, it's good for the world.
Given what you said earlier about counting from 1904, the century-plus long view in Australia that the United States is critical for Australia's own security, when you look at what's happening in this town, and I understand Canberra's had its own excitement recently, which I want to come back to, but when you look at what's happening in this town, which is gruesome in terms of sequestration, defense budget cuts, and the rest, does it give you pause?
It does. It really does. We want a strong United States. The US is capable of thinking of more than its narrowly defined self-interest. The US interest in non-proliferation, for example, serious commitment to non-proliferation, the US commitment to overseas development, Hillary Clinton campaigning for the rights of women and girls across the world, John Kerry, and on this issue, as on others, I got a huge rapport with him, campaigning on climate change and the environmental quality of the oceans. America is capable of thinking, the best of America is capable of thinking of global problems and challenges in more than a narrow definition of its self-interest. So some people have referred to America generously as the indispensable country. Of course, like any power, America makes mistakes. There's a lot to think about on the 10th anniversary of the commitment to the invasion of Iraq. But the world is better because of the American role, the American commitment to peace and stability and security. And that's only possible if America's strong domestically. So many people have made this point. I said when I was here a year ago that the one thing that stands between America and the banishing of all this talk of American decline is the challenge of debt and deficit. America's getting energy independence quite spectacularly, reviving manufacturing, cost competitive, it's got demographic dynamism, it's got great universities that the young people of Australia want to get to. These are unbeatable competitive advantages, but it's just got to fix up debt and deficit. We look at your political system, we see the Democrats challenged by the need to reform welfare, entitlements, and the Republicans challenged by the need to adjust tax concessions. And our instinct as a friend of America is just make some historic compromises. You must make this system of government, crafted as it was in the 1780s, you must make it work for the modern American world. As a friend of America, we assert our right to give you friendly advice. A good friend doesn't allow you to get in a car and leave a party or a dinner when you're drunk. And we're entitled as one of your oldest friends to say, in your own sake and for the sake of the world, just get this right. And it's the only thing that stands between you and the banishment of talk of America in decline.
Our problem is we have a car full of drunks. But the advice, I think, I have no doubt, the advice is appreciated and is accurate. What do you tell the region when people say, because I'm quite certain that our friends, partners, allies, enemies, neutrals throughout the region are interested in your view on the pivot and America's engagement in Asia. What do you tell them when they ask you if we have the wherewithal and the focus to continue what began about 2 years ago?
Yeah. Any projection of American power shows America having formidable power for as long as you can project, decades into the future. And figures can be made about aircraft carrier groups, for example. Can be made with other illustrations. So that's one response. The other response is just to tick off the list of competitive advantages America enjoys, like the one I referred to a moment ago. Some of them have grown very stronger, much stronger in the last few years. The trend towards energy independence and the revival of manufacturing in this country, for example. Another response is to refer to what John Kerry has said. When we did a joint press conference on Monday, I was asked this question. I said, I've got absolute confidence that this Secretary of State is as committed to deep American engagement with the region as his predecessor. And that was an opportunity for Secretary of State Kerry to refer to his long-standing commitment as a senator to opening up relations with Vietnam, something he tackled, if I remember correctly, with Senator John McCain, and to refer to his earliest work in the Senate, it must have been back in the 80s, on assisting the transition of the Philippines from dictatorship to pluralism. That is a deep engagement with the region, and I've got no criticism to make. I think he'll follow through on this, and I know as well that other focus of foreign policy, namely the White House, remains committed. The recent speech by Tom Donilon spelt this out very, very clearly.
We had, about a month ago, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in this room giving a keynote speech while he was in Washington, and he declared in English, Japan is back, and he described a foreign policy vision that was centered on a strong alliance with the U.S., but really emphasized India and Australia. And I'm interested in your views of where you see Japan going and where you see Australia-Japan relations going.
Yeah, we want, Japan is a very old friend of Australia's, and we've watched with concern their grappling with the economic challenges in the last 20 years. We're very encouraged by his commitment to an economic growth strategy. And of course our long-standing, much expressed policy has been a commitment to trilateral cooperation, Japan, us, the US. And that's reassuring to them. And every time I've addressed the question of North Korea's bellicose behaviour and actions, I've always expressed it in terms of Australia offering support and encouragement to Japan and of course South Korea.
Abe, when he was last Prime Minister, of course, proposed the Quad, U.S., Australia, Japan, India formulation. It was unclear whether he meant a summit or a foreign ministerial. It didn't ultimately go anywhere. But he has emphasized the importance of maritime states with democratic values aligning. As we build an architecture in the Pacific that's broad and inclusive, how do you see like-minded states working within that architecture to advance the values and interests we share? Should we have an explicit grouping? Should it be quieter? How do you see us working with Japan or India or Korea or other such states?
Yeah, Australia would not endorse an explicit grouping. A quad, I think, was speculative thinking by Prime Minister Abe. I think he first dealt with it when he was in opposition, and it's not something that we endorse. It could easily be misunderstood, and when I was in India recently, I did not even raise it. But certainly we see a lot in the trilateral, a continuation of our long-established trilateral engagement, Japan, the United States, and Australia. But of course, Japan, quite understandably, wants expressions of support given North Korea's behaviour. I know that China understands this. I think the Chinese alarm at the behaviour of their partner and ally, North Korea. I was almost tempted to insert the adjective erstwhile partner and neighbour. So serious has been the Chinese distancing from North Korea, criticism of North Korea, means that Japan wants assurance, needs assurance, deserves it more than ever.
You mentioned North Korea. Secretary Hagel announced we're essentially shifting the national missile defense resources towards the West Coast, Alaska. We have a new station in Japan. Missile defense is becoming an important feature of our response to North Korea. I'd be interested in your views on Australia's piece of that, but also now that you're going to be taking some of this burden off our shoulders, hopefully in the Security Council, how you see the next steps on dealing with North Korea, which is clearly on a path towards trying to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear warheads.
Yeah, well, the first question that arises is enforcing the sanctions that have been agreed on by the Security Council, to seeing that they are rendered effective. And we want to engage with neighbours in Australia's north about seeing that interdiction of all cargoes headed towards North Korea is enforced vigorously. So the enforcement of that quite strong sanctions regime that we developed working with Japan, with South Korea, and it was endorsed with the support of China, of course, is the first challenge. Second, we will look at further autonomous sanctions, that is sanctions on top of those that have been endorsed by the UN, and we'll liaise with our partners about those. Third, and it is related, we've just voted, we strongly supported the move by the Human Rights Council in Geneva to establish an international inquiry into the catastrophic position of human rights in North Korea, where it's estimated 1 in 20 citizens is within one of their grotesquely cruel camps, concentration camps, where there is a gulag that would rival that of Stalin. This is related to what they've done on nuclear tests and missiles. The commitment to nuclear tests and missiles raises higher the wall that keeps their own 22 million citizens in prison. By developing this nuclearized prowess, they're signalling to the world that we are free to imprison and starve and brutally mistreat our own citizens.
Let me go a bit beyond Asia. President Obama just gave a quite consequential speech in Israel. I think it was well received. I think most people are going to look at it and see it as a shift, if a subtle shift in U.S. policy, in a way that's more favorable for Israel compared to where the administration was in the past. You've articulated slightly different formulations on the Israel-Palestine issue, which some people have interpreted as shifting slightly more in favor of the Palestinian side. Are we well aligned on this? Do you think we have the U.S. and Australia a common vision?
Aligned. Yeah, I would say totally aligned. And snapping awake at 3:30 this morning as a result of the extreme jet lag Australian foreign ministers experience going anywhere in the world except New Zealand. I turned on TV, I heard part of the president's speech, and I said, that's exactly what we've been advocating. exactly what we've been advocating. When we talk about offering hope to Palestinians on the West Bank, I mean the moderate Palestinians on the West Bank, we do so because it's right for them, but it is security for Israel. The guarantee for Israel's security, ultimately, is a Palestinian state, side by side, with a pluralist political system and no room for Hezbollah and other extremist elements, Hamas, that want the destruction of Israel. It's a Palestinian state that recognises Israel's right to exist. And that's why I was proud late last year to see that Australia declined to vote against the bid for enhanced Palestinian status. And I was just struck by how many Israelis and how many supporters of Israel in Australia told me, some of them on the quiet, that they thought that was an indispensable message to be sent to the supporters of more settlements in Israel. I intended it to do just that, to be a message that if more and more settlements are built, you'll never get a Palestinian state, and without a Palestinian state, Israel will be trapped. I use the verb advisedly, governing a burgeoning Arab population that to whom it cannot grant full civic rights. And then the world will turn and use very derogatory language about Israel in those circumstances. So to save Israel from that fate, we need to persuade the Israeli government not to pursue settlements. And we need to send a message of hope to Palestinians while at the same time insisting to them, first, they're not to exploit this vote in the UN by doing anything premature or provocative. And second, the only way to get a Palestinian state, and this is where we chime completely with President Obama's position, the only way to get a Palestinian state is through negotiations with the Israelis, not through a vote in the UN. But in the meantime, we send a message about settlements, and we send a message of hope to people who are living without much.
How do we convince Israelis, and for a variety of reasons we need to convince Israelis, that we're serious about Iran's nuclear program?
I think there are a range of options. First, by maintaining even stricter sanctions against Iran. We know the sanctions, the best intelligence are that the sanctions are hurting. We need to go even further, and Australia will be in the front rank of nations doing that. Second, by persisting with negotiations, because the messages out of Iran aren't altogether dismissive or negative. And third, for the United States, it's not the Australian position, but it's the United States position, and it's an understandable one, to maintain that nothing is taken off the table and to explore security guarantees, protective guarantees for Israel.
Let me turn briefly to politics and then open the floor. I've watched with fascination the recent carnage is probably too strong a word, but maneuverings within the Labour Party. You still have a long way to go before you match our levels of dysfunctionality in politics, so please don't worry about that. But I noticed last night when we were at Kim Beazley's house, when you spoke with the press, you described Tony Abbott's policies as extremist several times, which is exactly what President Obama did to Mitt Romney, and it's good politics. But is there a pronounced difference with the Liberal Party and the coalition on foreign policy?
That's a good question. On the surface, I think any observer would be struck by consensus positions across Australian politics, for example, in support for the American alliance and in the rejection of any notion of containing China and support for deeper engagement with China. These are common to both sides of Australian politics. The Conservatives in our political system don't own the American alliance. On the Labor Party side, we remind people there was a John Curtin Labor government in World War II that made the first explicit overtures to the United States. And to be fair, to be non-partisan, we on the Labor side, having recognised China in 1972, the Whitlam Labor government did that, we can't maintain that we've got a monopoly on the Australia-China relationship. So that's a bipartisan, that's a consensus across Australian politics, both those propositions. I would say, though, that there is an undertow in Tony Abbott's policies of a hankering for what he calls the Anglosphere. And I would say that raises the possibility of a retreat from the engagement with Asia, the engagement with the rest of the world that we, the present government, are very proud of pursuing. We're very proud of that 140 votes we got on that ballot in the General Assembly for a seat on the Security Council. But we did it because we're pursuing engagement with the Caribbean, with Latin America, with Africa, as well as Asia. We're seen as a good global citizen. I think the Tony Abbott, the repeated Tony Abbott references to an Anglosphere suggest that were he to be Prime Minister, he'd be beating a retreat into some sort of old-fashioned British Dominion view of the world. And I think that would be sad. There'd be a lot of missed opportunities for Australia. And I think if he did that in government, those repeated references to the Anglosphere, Asia, with which we're pursuing very explicit policies of engagement, especially after the production of the recent white paper, Australia in the Asian Century, Asia would probably put the wrong interpretation on it and say he's doing something akin to Pauline Hanson's policies. Now that would be an unfair interpretation, but if you've got an Australian Prime Minister who's talking about going back to the Anglosphere, then it will be distorted in all sorts of ways that will do damage to Australia's national interest.
I assume the Anglosphere means the English-speaking peoples and that we're in it. Right?
Yeah, you'd be included,
Good,
and a couple of others.
What seems like one difference from here is a similar difference between Republicans and Democrats, which is the criticism of the government that you have cut defense spending too much and are not resourcing Australia's overall strategy in the region. It seems like a pronounced difference from here. Do you think it is?
It's not a difference between the parties in Australia. The coalition.
No, I mean in Australia. It seems like there's a difference.
In Australia, the coalition has said, has ruled out promising to reverse the budgetary measures as they affect defence. We're still per capita one of the biggest investors in defence in the world.
Last question, very unfair. How do you feel about prospects for September when there is supposed to be an election?
Look, we've done ourselves a fair bit of harm in the leadership contest that has been such a high-profile thing in recent months. But the Australian Labor Party, at its best, has got a great capacity for survival. And there's a deep reluctance by the Australian people to entrust their future to the Tony Abbott-led opposition. The Labor Party's got to close the ranks. The Labor Party's got to put this leadership bickering behind it. It's got to focus in the countdown to the election on the differences between it and the Conservatives and fight like mad to see that the Australian people understand the big choice before it. I think things clarify remarkably in the last few weeks of an election campaign.
How do you close ranks? It seems like over the last year, the trend is in the other direction, especially in the last week. What has to be done at the leadership level to close ranks?
That's a justified question. I think though Julia Gillard has been able to confirm and renew her leadership with what happened in the parliamentary party in the last couple of days. It's a matter now of building on that and reaching out. The party now must be seen as talking to the Australian people, not bickering within its party room. And I believe under Julia Gillard's leadership, the party will do that. And I'm still an optimist. As an election narrows people's views on politics to a choice between alternatives, we'll come back. The Labor Party will come back. It looks excessively optimistic at the present time, but I'm prepared to lay that down as a prediction now.
Thank you. You know, when you talk to an American Secretary of State, you're not really able to ask about domestic politics. But in the Westminster system, we are allowed to indulge ourselves. So
Yep.
I appreciate that. The floor is open. Please identify yourselves. Stanley? We have microphones coming up.
Boeing, is it on? I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk about ASEAN in general and Indonesia in particular. Looking from the outside, it seems that ASEAN suffered a significant setback at the meetings last year when China was able to achieve an outcome, taking advantage of the ASEAN position on needing unity. And the question is that a trend or is that a one-off, since the U.S. has put so much stock in working with ASEAN? With Indonesia, all of us are looking at the upcoming elections. Sandy Berger and I lived through a very turbulent period in the Clinton administration with Indonesia. It looks a whole lot better than we ever could have dreamt back then. But now we look at the presidential choices and we just ask, is that going to hold all the progress in Indonesia?
Yep. We're very optimistic in Australia about Indonesia. You look at it, 6% per annum growth rate. It's had the most solid growth in the region in the last 13 years of any nation. It's creating a large consuming class, which will mean more economic integration with Australia. It cooperates with us very closely on counter-terrorism. It's put the lives of its police, its security forces on the line to track down terrorists. Our biggest embassy in the world in terms of the number of diplomats is in Jakarta, and Australia is developing, I think has developed, just first-class expertise in interpreting Indonesia and the other nations of Southeast Asia. We're altogether optimistic about it. I think Indonesia is a pluralist society and a robust democracy. It's got a strong parliamentary system, a multi-party system that's clarified itself. It's got freedom of expression, and a focus on human rights. I think one can be very optimistic about it. We want ASEAN. We want to see ASEAN succeed in coordinating something as important as negotiating a code of conduct on the South China Sea. They haven't been able to do that. The differences are real, but that, set on one side, shouldn't outweigh its successes. If you look at the way, it's a relatively modest example, an important one in the region though, look at the way Indonesia provided advice to Thein Sein, the reformist president of Myanmar. He said, we had military rule in Indonesia, but we decided the role of the military is in the barracks. And coming from a former general, in politics, in democratic politics, that was a message that resonated in Yangon, a message that couldn't have been delivered more effectively by anyone else. So that's the best of ASEAN. The ASEAN emphasis on their own centrality, the ASEAN emphasis on connectivity. If you can connect Myanmar into the dynamic economic growth of Thailand, for example, then you're making a big contribution to what I see as a zone of prosperity between Assam and Yunnan. And ASEAN is, as they'd insist, it's their word, central to that. So I think they face challenges with the coordinated diplomacy that they should aspire to on getting that code of conduct. But one should be encouraged by what's happened in Southeast Asia, and the economic growth has just delivered a stunning turnaround on all the social indicators. Look at those Asian countries. You've now got women, by and large, with full rights in education, and in some of them more girls in higher education than boys. On all the social indicators, you've got a stunning confirmation of the progress that ASEAN has been part of.
Yes, right over here, front.
Hi, my name is... Is it on?
You have to push up.
Hello? It's on, it's on. Okay. My name is Eric Lowe. I'm with the Fair Observer. My question is, you just mentioned Pauline Hanson, and also the situation with the Anglo zone. The point is that now Australia has been a big, business partner with China. In fact, it is one of the places Chinese people immigrate and a lot of doing business there. So do you think that it is a pushback to all this China cooperation that some Australian politician thinks that we should move away from that and back to the old days of the Anglo power, or is just a pushback at this point?
Yeah. Let me clarify that. Engagement with China is, as I said, a bipartisan position, a consensus position in Australian politics. No one in Australian politics, I can think of no one in the Australian Parliament, would want to turn back on our engagement with Asia. My concern is that if an Australian Conservative Prime Minister talks about the Anglosphere, whether he likes it or not, there'd be an interpretation placed on that in Asia. Both sides of Australian politics have taken a stand for increased investment by China and other Asian countries in Australia. China, there are no impediments on Chinese investment in Australia. China could not face a climate more conducive to investment by private or state-owned enterprises than Australia provides them. A Chinese corporation, I forget whether it was state-owned or privatised, just bought a rural property that grows cotton, that is the largest holder of irrigation licenses in Australia. There's only been one item of Chinese investment in Australia proposed that's been rejected by the government. And again, that's a position across Australian politics. There's no turning back. Australia, the largest source of migrants for Australia for 10 years has been China, and currently, in the last 12 months, the largest source of migrants to Australia has been India. There's no turning back, and no one in the Australian Parliament would seek to turn back.
Yes, sir. The grey suit on this side.
Good morning. My name is Russ Webster. I work for Cardno, a global company actually headquartered in Brisbane. And it's a unique opportunity to hear from you this morning. I wanted to just quickly indulge the audience, if I could, if you look beyond the region that we're talking about today, particularly to one of the continents with the most rapidly growing economic opportunity, Africa. I wanted to just hear from you briefly as Australia gets more and more engaged there, particularly in the mining sector. How do you see a partnership with the U.S. ideally formulating for the benefit of both of our countries, as well as particularly the benefit of Africa as it becomes more and more of interest?
Well, you'd know that Australia's got a mining boom. That mining boom has spilled over into Africa. Australian companies or Australian-based companies have got $50 billion invested in mining in Africa. And on the back of that, we're running diplomatic engagement. So every year we have a conference in Perth, Australia's western capital, called Africa Down Under, which draws officials in mining ministries, mining-related companies, mines ministers from Africa, draws them to Australia so that we share expertise. In 2 Australian universities, we've got units devoted to lifting the skills of officials in the developing world when it comes to managing mining. One of our contributions to the success of Myanmar is aid directed at helping them assess the environmental impact of mining, train mines inspectors, achieve benchmarks for occupational health and safety for the workers in mines. It is an area of Australian expertise, and it renders us suddenly relevant and useful throughout Africa. Our companies used to meeting Australian standards are responsible investors in Africa, and they're just about everywhere in Africa, even in Mali, as I found out recently when I looked at our vulnerabilities given what was happening in that country. And off the back of that mining comes diplomacy. And also comes a targeted aid program. I was at a Commonwealth conference in London, and Bernard Membe, the Foreign Minister of Tanzania, bounced up to me, introduced himself. He said, "You Australians have been very helpful. Your aid program works very well." He said, "Near where I live, there's a river, a deep gorge. The farmers couldn't easily get to their fields." He said, "Your High Commissioner, Ambassador, put money into a bridge. He said the farmers can get to their fields without any trouble. And he said the kids no longer get taken by crocodiles. He said that's how useful it is. So the traction in our relationship with Africa, a whole bundle of new relationships for us, is in effective aid and mining. In fact, I've been astonished by how much diplomacy can ride off the back of mining investment.
Yes, sir. Right in front of you. There you go. That's it. Stop. Thanks. Yeah. The gentleman, right. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Is this on?
It is.
Okay. I'm Andre Sauvageau, and I'm the Chief Representative for Vietnam for the Interstate Traveler Company in Detroit, Michigan, and some other things. But anyway, great presentation. My question is this. First of all, let me just state the fullest agreement with, your remarks on improving relations with China and the United States, not choosing. Absolutely right. But my question, within that context, I'm asking if Australia and the United States both, and some others, aren't taking if they shouldn't, in their own interest, and China's own interest, ironically, take a little more realistic stand about their naked aggression against the exclusive economic zones of Vietnam and the Philippines and others, but particularly in view of the fact that they're violating with impunity the United Nations 1982 Convention on the Law of the Sea, which defines the exclusive economic zones of these countries out to 200 nautical miles. Okay. And in Vietnam, the Chinese warships come in to the EEZ like they did even a couple years ago and cut the cable of the civilian ship Binh Minh Kong Hai, was just doing seismic surveys with Petro Vietnam, the state petroleum company. And then he even sent a message last year, remember, to India, telling Prime Minister Singh that he shouldn't implement the contracts he already signed with the state petroleum company.
Good.
Anyway,
I know the list, and it's much longer, so I think...
Okay, I'm sorry, but it's just a question that
yeah.
If it wouldn't be in everybody's interest to take it, not just to call them disputes, like a dispute between the Third Reich and Poland or something.
Yeah, let me take that. It is an important question. We insist we cannot take sides in what we insist are disputes. If all the details were put before me on this table, I would not be in a position to arbitrate the difference between Vietnam and China, or the difference between the Philippines and China, the difference between Brunei and China. So we, like the United States for that matter, have got to say we can't take a side, we remain neutral, but we do say to the parties we've got an interest in traffic on the seas. 60 or 70% of our merchandise trade goes through the South China Sea, and therefore have an interest in the peaceful resolution of these disputes, with reference to international law, including, but not exclusively limited to, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, to which you referred. That's got to be our position. But let me introduce something new into this. A way of all of us, China and Southeast Asia, keeping one dominating narrative on the front page of the world's media out of Southeast Asia: economic growth and social improvement. I want that to be the great narrative out of this region, not an alternative narrative of tensions and disputes, battles over sovereignty, people not investing in the region because they think it could flare into war. How do you get that? Here's my notion. We've toyed with it in the past, but I think it's now time for Australia to elevate it. It's the notion that we should set aside the territorial disputes. Get agreement from the relevant nations to say it is going to be very hard to resolve these differences over sovereignty. We're going to put them to one side. Second, to study the three precedents in Southeast Asia for doing this and developing the resources and sharing the benefits of the resources. 3, to engage with universities and think tanks, with retired diplomats, 1.5-track diplomacy, if you want to call it that, in getting moral resource sharing agreements that both sides to the disputes could endorse, live with, implement. To look at the prospects for one of those big Chinese companies developing a resource and being rewarded for it, and for one of the nations currently in dispute with China to then have claim to the resource, or vice versa. There are 3 precedents, again, for such agreements in Southeast Asia, one involving, for example, Thailand and Malaysia. We can have these fights over sovereignty that may not be resolved for decades. We can face a situation where an incident between a fishing vessel and a naval vessel could flare into conflict depending on the state of mind of local commanders and sea captains. Don't forget that World War I nearly started in 1908 with an incident at sea, the Tangier incident. It nearly flared. This can happen, and we should avoid it. The story out of Southeast Asia should continue to be one of countries hauling themselves out of poverty and lack of development, dragging Myanmar with them, dragging the lagging states with them. That zone of prosperity between Assam and Yunnan. And they can only do it if the dominating narrative is not one of territorial conflict and the tensions that go with it. Resource sharing agreements is an approach that Australia, quietly, persuasively, I hope, can introduce to this discussion, sponsor into this debate, and allow the parties to look at the merits and make up their own minds.
I hope you do. You'll be doing us all a great service. Minister, you're a great friend of America. I understand you're going to Appomattox this weekend?
I'd like to, if I can persuade the ambassador who's got an aversion to Civil War history to take me there.
My grandfather's grandfather was there with the 14th Pennsylvania Cavalry. And my wife from Virginia her family's on the other side.
Yeah, well, your
So I can't
family,
convince
your
her to
family
go.
was on the right side,
Right.
of course.
And I can't convince my wife to go. She'll go anywhere else except Appomattox. Well, you're a great friend of America and a great student of our history and clearly of Asia. And we're grateful that you shared this time with us. Thank you, Sandy Berger, for opening our proceedings. Ernie and your staff and the embassy staff, thank you. And let's thank the minister.
Great.